My name is Stephanie Wolf, and I am the Membership Relations Coordinator at Population Connection. Thank you all for joining us in marking this year's Earth Overshoot Day, which is the date humanity's demand for resources has surpassed what the planet can regenerate in a given year. This year, that date falls on Thursday, July 24th, 8 days earlier than last year. To dive deeper into Earth Overshoot, I'm joined by our speaker, David Lin, Chief Science Officer at the Global Footprint Network. The Global Footprint Network is an international sustainability organization that is helping the world live within the Earth's means and respond to climate change. In Dr. Lin's role, he oversees the science related to ecological footprint and biocapacity accounting. If you have questions for our speaker, please drop those in the Q&A box, and that is found at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to get those questions answered along with the pre-submitted questions answered during the Q&A session facilitated by our senior analyst, Hannah Evans. And then for any questions we don't have time to answer, we will provide written responses along with a recording of this presentation and access to the chat box discussion. Those are all the housekeeping items from me. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to send the floor over to you.
Well, this is great. This is certainly one of the bigger turnouts that I've had for an Earth Overshoot Day webinar. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Can everyone see that and get started here? All right. So, as we've discussed already, Earth Overshoot Day this year falls on July 24th. It's the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources exceeds what the Earth can regenerate. So, what does it mean? What are some insights and implications of this? And at the end, I'm going to get into looking at the way forward more generally. So to get started here, I want to touch upon a little bit of the underlying science and concepts. This is something that I can really dive deep into, but I'm going to try to keep things pretty simple and high level so we can get through everything today. It's really interesting to think of Earth as essentially a spaceship. If you think about life on Earth, you can think about how it sits on that very thin layer. It might be roughly most of life on Earth is within, 2 miles up from where you're sitting or 2 miles down. And that's a tiny little crust on this spaceship that's flying through our solar system. What is it that's unique about that layer around Earth? What is the property that supports life? It is, life on Earth is solar powered. Ultimately, the sun is powering photosynthesis, which powers ecosystems and supports 99.9% of life on Earth. So fundamentally, we can ask, we can look at these properties and we can say, well, how much life support do we need? There are some really basic principles we can think about in terms of sustainability. But the first one is, if we harvest resources faster than they regenerate, we deplete them. And taking a step further, if we produce waste faster than it's assimilated, it accumulates. So if we're living on this closed sort of spaceship wandering through powered by the sun, these are very important principles to follow. They're actually called Daly's Principles of Sustainability. He's the former chief economist of the World Bank. So if we look at some of the numbers, we can ask, well, how much bioproductive area is there available on Earth? If we omit sort of the deserts, the high Arctic, and some areas of the ocean where there's very little productivity, we get about 30 billion acres of bioproductive land. And that's in metric terms, that's about 12 billion hectares. So if you divide that by the number of people we have on Earth, that's about 3.7 acres per person. So we can think about it almost like a farm. And of course, in metric terms, that's about 1.5 hectares per person. But how much is required to support humanity's demand? If we add all of our demands up, that's about 53 billion acres or 21 billion hectares. And on a per person average, that's about 6.5 acres per person. So what is the demand that we're talking about here? We are talking about the ecological footprint. So it's a measure of consumption as demand on productive surface areas. And there are, in our accounting methodology, about 6 categories or ways in which we account for humans using or demanding land area. So those are through forest products. We demand wood, we demand timber to make wood, to make houses. We demand space for sequestration of the carbon footprint. So it takes biocapacity to sequester our waste emissions, and we can calculate how much that takes. We use land for producing crops. We use it for producing rearing livestock. We also occupy land just by building upon it. That's called the built-up land footprint. And we take fish out of the water. That's another way that we pull regeneration from the earth. And when you look at all of these, you add these all together, you can see that all of them are roughly increasing over time. The one that's increased the most since 1961 is the carbon footprint. It's currently the largest footprint. And altogether, our total footprint is roughly equivalent to 1.8 Earths worth of biocapacity. So it takes about 1.8 Earths worth of regeneration to meet that demand. So what is it that we actually do? We're producing what we would call ecological supply and demand statements, and this is the data that goes in. And it's actually data that we produce for every country of the world. The data goes back to 1961, because that's basically when we have input for. And here you can see the state of the world. You can see that biocapacity per capita is decreasing over time. Footprint per capita has varied a little bit. You can have a look at the United States. We can see that the footprint is larger than biocapacity, although both are displaying somewhat of a decreasing trend in more recent years. And another example, just to have a look at it, here we can see Canada. They have a large biocapacity per capita compared to their footprint. So this is what we would call a biocapacity reserve. And the United States is what we would call running a biocapacity deficit. So what does the data tell us when we take a little bit of a closer look? If we look at all of the countries at once, what we can see is in this animation over time is that the red countries are countries where the footprint exceeds biocapacity, and those in green are where biocapacity still exceeds the footprint. What you can see is that more and more countries are having and running biocapacity deficits. So if we think about each country as a farm, basically they are exceeding what their farm can regenerate. So we know that overshoot's increasing. We know that the global ecological footprint is increasing faster than biocapacity. And we can achieve a one planet footprint globally with some countries in deficit, but for a net whole, all countries can't be importing more than they produce. And more we are seeing that there are farm countries still in existence that supply biocapacity to the rest of the world. We can also take a look at resource distributions. This is kind of a complicated figure, so I'm going to walk through it a little bit. On the vertical axis, we can see countries that are either in biocapacity reserve or deficit. So up there again, you see Canada. They run a pretty good reserve. So on the vertical axis, we're looking at biocapacity resources, and on the horizontal axis, we're looking at GDP. Why are we looking at GDP? Because that's how we purchase resources. If you think about a city, most of us don't produce our own food. We don't have our personal farms where we survive off of everything. We actually earn money and we buy resources from outside of our cities, outside of our households, outside of our homesteads. This is a way of looking at that at a country level. So towards the right, you have higher income countries, and towards the left, you have lower income countries. So if we look at the percent population of the world that sits in these quadrants, we see that 14% of the world population lives in a country with a biocapacity reserve, and 80% of the world population lives in a country with a biocapacity deficit. Now, that's an interesting observation. It's not necessarily a bad thing. As we know, we need to purchase resources, we need trade, and we need to we make money, we provide goods and services, and we trade that for biocapacity. But what's interesting is if we take that world average per capita income line and we look left and right of it, we actually see that 72% of the world's population lives in a country that faces a dual resource challenge. They run both a biocapacity deficit and they live in a country that has below average per capita income. Now we know if as we move forward in the world, that resources are constrained, they're limited. So having below average purchasing power means you're competing on a global market for a limited supply of resources. And what we see is that this is going to be an increasingly challenging situation for these countries. All right, so talking a little bit more about what that means moving forwards, we can think of the planet and resources not simply as life support, but also a means to an end. So many of you may have seen or be familiar with this figure. It basically says that the economy is a subsystem of the society, and both of those are subsystems of the environment. And because of that fact, they must maintain a size that is within the larger sphere. We can think of the environment then as the ultimate means to an ultimate goal. And one way of looking at this is looking at the ultimate goal as well-being. So you can think of this natural resource space, and in the middle is our society and our economy where we produce and consume resources in order to achieve well-being. Ultimately, one way of thinking about this is a very sort of pro-human, human-centric approach, and in some ways quite utilitarian. When we take a little bit closer look at this, the UN set forth what they call the Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea behind this is to have goals in each of these different rungs. So have goals looking at our natural resource space and how to maintain it and how to have a thriving planet. But also how to maintain our production and consumption within what we would call a safe operating space that is within that natural resource space. in order to achieve well-being. So well-being is really only a condition that can be met if humanity can operate within our planetary boundaries. While we might be going forward in trying to achieve well-being, we need to make sure that consumption and production operates within that safe space, that is within our natural resource space. So a much simpler way of looking at this is something that we quite often use, is how to achieve well-being within the means of the planet. So in this figure, we're looking at the Human Development Index on the x-axis. Essentially, this is an index produced by the UN, and it gives you an idea, a very rough idea, of well-being. So as we go right on this figure, we would be living better lives. And on the vertical axis, we're looking at the axis of sustainability. So this is actually the ecological footprint. So as you go down in this figure, you are having lower resource metabolism. And in that bottom right corner is what we like to call the global sustainable development quadrant. So each dot on this figure represents a country, and this is produced from data from 2022 on the ecological footprint per capita of every country and the Human Development Index. And as you see, there's kind of this curve as you go towards the right of better well-being, you are increasing the footprint. So essentially, you can look at sort of the spread of countries here as almost representative of the cost of traditional, I guess what you would call development. And what we're seeing is that it comes at a high cost. As we improve our lives, we are using more and more ecological resources. Our footprint is increasing. So you have countries on the bottom left who have quite low footprints, but it may not be enough to sustain them to live great lives. And you have countries on the right that have much higher resource consumption and seem to be living better lives. So the question is, how do we push all these dots towards the bottom right? How do we really optimize these actions for a regenerative economy and improving human well-being? Or can we ask the question about, is it just how do we do what we've been doing more efficiently? This is really, an important way of thinking about this. How do we actually skip through that path and have all countries go towards the bottom right? Here's just a really interesting little animation that shows how that has been changing over time. You see a bunch of countries pop up. You can see two large countries in Asia. You can probably guess what countries those are because the size of the dot are representative of population. And there's a lot of sort of noise, but you can see that as we go through time, and this, unfortunately, this chart only goes up to 2014, we are seeing countries move to the right and continue to move up. So go back a second. You might ask, what are sort of those countries that are just on the cusp? I can give you a couple examples and tell you that two of those that are Asian countries are Sri Lanka and the Philippines. But because there's quite a lot of noise in the data, that the dots move and rearrange themselves a little bit more every year. So moving forward, one way we can think about this is to say, if we know that the future has never been more predictable, we know there's going to be more climate change. We know very clearly that there are going to be fewer ecological resources. And we know that in the future, we're going to be out of fossil fuel. Then the question becomes, can we really afford not to be ready for the predictable future? It's approaching much more rapidly in companies, cities, organizations can expect. If we take this as our context, we know that resource security is becoming an increasingly crucial aspect. And if climate change and resource constraints are really going to be reshaping the context in which we all operate and survive and try to live good lives, then what it would mean is that we should be aggressively preparing ourselves biophysically and economically. There really isn't a business case in waiting. There's no need to wait for international agreements, cooperations, regulations. In essence, what we see is that climate change and resource constraints are our context. So there's a couple ways of thinking about this. Can we think of it as a burden? Or what happens if we think of it as our context? When we shift to thinking about it as our context, we then move forward and say, well, how do I succeed? How do I live a good life within this context? And we can use that to drive our actions. Conversely, if we think of it as a burden, it often leads to inaction. Oh, someone else needs to take the burden because it's causing my life to be worse. And we see that both at the national level, but we think about that, we can see that in sort of our individual communications as well. So this is a key kind of mindset shift. And it's also why when we talk about how we get there, we often refer to our campaign that we run. We call it the power of possibility. And again, the idea is that there is really no need to wait. There are plenty of viable possibilities. We've compiled over 100 of them. We didn't do the primary research. A lot of this research is out there. It's been done by major organizations. We just translated these into overshoot days and possibilities. So here we identified over 100 ways of moving Earth Overshoot Day backwards. And we've calculated how much each one would move the date. I encourage you to go look at this webpage and have a look and dive in. There's links to all of the primary research on this. But in general, we often get quite a lot of questions on what can we do? Well, in terms of solutions, we've also categorized on the Power of Possibility page the 5 biggest ways we can help reduce overshoot and move the date. So I'll go through each of these briefly. The first one is planet. Of course, this is managing, supporting, and helping nature thrive. Not only do we love nature and it makes our lives better, it is our life support system. So the more we can do that, the better off we will be. The second is cities. I like to call this one infrastructure. And the key point here is that the way we design and manage our cities dictates how we move and how we use energy. We can think about the United States back in the 50s when the vision of the future was sort of the American automobile. And it's why we created the interstate system. And it's locked in. There's this, what we call this lock-in effect. And it's why we have huge freeways running through the middle of our cities today. It's very hard to change infrastructure once we've produced it. You can look at European cities and the tiny little streets, and you can imagine how they were developed and why they were developed. Probably for horses to go through with bigger roads going around the cities. that infrastructure that was produced 500 years ago is still dictates the way people move and use energy today. And this is one of the most important things we can start doing early, is changing the way we move and use energy. Um, and the next one, how we power ourselves. This one is pretty obvious. Fossil fuel is creating climate change and much more than that. So we need to move into more efficient renewable energies as we move forward. I think this one everyone is quite aware of. The next one is food. We may not be aware, but feeding the human population requires about 50% of Earth's biocapacity. Um, there are much more efficient ways to not only to consume different types of food or produce different types of food, but also to create circular economies to turn wastes into fuel for and create regenerative agricultural systems that are much more efficient and that don't create as much waste in the world. And the last one, obviously, is population. The more of us there are here, the more mouths there are to feed, people to house, and um, that one's quite straightforward and a mathematical uh, reality that we deal with. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and close that presentation and open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you so much. That was very informative, and we've got plenty of time for questions. We've got about 30 minutes, so I'm looking forward to diving into this Q&A. Some of you have already voiced in the chat some questions, and if any of you would like to do so as well, please feel free. We will get to as many as possible. Okay, so I feel like there's a lot to cover. You covered a lot of very broad information, and there's a lot to kind of dive into in terms of the nuances and complexities. But I think just to start off, I wanted to ask you, you were talking all about, the relationship between biocapacity and people using resources and how that differs across the globe, and obviously in terms of resource use and consumption, that's also something that varies very widely. So within the context of the human population, are you and is your organization kind of advocating for any particular number of people that can sustainably live on the planet? Are you trying to work to reduce the population in a certain way or a certain capacity or to a certain number? Or what's your approach there? How do you approach carrying capacity?
Right. So carrying capacity is a really interesting question because there's a lot of moving parts. As I would say, as sort of a scientific concept, it's much more difficult to apply to humans
Mhm.
because everybody lives in different ways.
Mhm.
If simply by living in a hotter or colder environment, you know, that will change the resources that you require. So actually, it's quite interesting because the concepts of biocapacity and footprint arose from that, but it kind of flipped it on its head. We can't really say, oh, a human needs X amount of calories to survive, because that it varies widely based on how big are you, how old are you, how young are you, how active are you, where do you live, how cold is it, how warm is it, what sort of all sorts of environmental factors. So the methodology really flips it on its head and says, well, what does this population use and how much biocapacity is available in this region? So it's really an accounting approach rather than a theoretical approach. And I think in having an accounting approach, it lends itself towards more practical action. We treat it very much like income and expenditure of your bank account. If you have a lot of income, is there anything wrong with spending that in a certain way? If we're in deficit, you should be looking very closely at it. So there's a lot of complexities to managing it, but in essence, it starts with an accounting statement.
Interesting. And so in thinking about like places with really high amounts of biocapacity, like you mentioned Canada, and then I also saw in many places actually in sub-Saharan Africa have a really high biocapacity. Like in a perfect world, just theoretically speaking, do you think that it would be best if humans could move to areas with more biocapacity so then they could consume more? Or do you think how should that be distributed?
Right. I think that's a really interesting and challenging question. The fact is we live in a globalized society,
Mhm.
and we're not advocating anti-trade. The idea of trade, is how economies function. We, on an individual basis, like I said, we earn money and we trade that hard work that we did that was hopefully towards something that is improving the well-being of society. It's something that, we're being paid. Money is value, and we're being paid because we're providing value to the human population, to society. So in different areas of the world, you can produce different things. You might have apples over here, you might have oranges over there, and you say, okay, I want that. I can trade you this, or I can produce, really good services. I can produce wonderful clocks that provide value to humanity, and I'll trade you for your food that you produce. That's really great. So I think it's less of advocating what the world could be, but more of looking at where we are now and saying, well, we're in this situation. How do we actually make our lives better? Because every country, every individual, every population is going to have a different context. And some populations of the world they're struggling right now. So the way forward is going to be different for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of touched on the economic implications of this, and I was noticing in the solutions you provided for the move the date. Yeah. There isn't much discussion on economic alternatives. And you were saying that you're not, as an organization, necessarily anti-trade and recognizing that trade is really important and we live in a globalized economy and that is what it is. But I'm also wondering, is there not some fundamental issues with the ways in which our capitalist economy operates that is contributing so much to these sort of ecological overshoots and environmental decline? I'm thinking about, the fundamental premise of consumption, which is needed for economic growth, and then, yeah, our globalized economy, which is producing and trading goods on the global marketplace in ways that are really unsustainable within the context of something like bioregionalism or, um, you know, conscious production, sustainable production. So, yeah, what is your thoughts on that? Do we
Yeah,
need?
so you've touched on a lot of
Yeah.
good concepts here, and I think there are a bunch of different levers in which we can approach this. One of I think one of the fundamental I think economic elements that you can think about is simply how, quite early on in economics, we talk about the environment as an externality. One way we can start to integrate that is to say that, well, all of the resources we're extracting right now, they're undervalued. If we know that there's going to be more scarcity in the future, then we actually should be paying more for the resources. And what that means is that resources would be better maintained, and resources would be basically given a higher value. Biocapacity would be given a higher value on the market. And one idea that we've been moving forward with is actually working with the countries that have major biocapacity reserves and talking with their governments, working with them on how do we, instead of treating this as, essentially what we see is what we would call liquidation of natural capital. But instead of doing that, how do we maintain natural capital? Because we know its value is going to be increasing as it becomes more scarce. I think maybe to dive a little bit deeper into that, there are many ways in which there are economically viable solutions that also increase the way or the efficiency by which things are produced. And I think maybe that's what you were getting to. Most of the solutions that we have proposed or sort of highlighted on our website are those that are currently today economically viable and scalable.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that. There's a question in the chat that kind of relates to this, but we're now moving a little bit into a different subject just by asking how much can we actually reverse the overshoot by actually doing the things that are suggested, I think here on this slide. Like, is there, the question's asking if there's an equation for this, or is there any sort of mathematics behind like how much we could actually contribute to declining overshoot?
Right. So a lot of this, it's a slow boat to turn. We do have a page that has the calculation of how many days it would move back by, I think, 2050 if these were enacted and fully realized. So there are, quite some of them are quite significant. So I would encourage you to go have a look at that page and browse through those. And I think one really important thing one way to view this is it's not a binary. I think in sort of the blurb going out for this webinar that we use the phrase, we're going to get out of overshoot by design or disaster. And there is truth to that. But the point is that there is a realm of sort of human well-being. And we are in a tight situation. And the more we do, it's incremental. The more we do, the better it's going to be for more people on Earth. The more people will be able to live better lives on Earth and avoid suffering. It's not an all or nothing.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm wondering what you think, and as you have kind of alluded to and said directly, there are many aspects of this, and it's kind of a multifaceted question and answer. But what do you think in terms of action items for us as individuals? Like, what is the best way for us as Americans, ostensibly, or I don't know, maybe there's some international attendees here. But people living in sort of high consuming societies, what's the best and most effective way that we can reduce our carbon footprints and contribute to the decline of overshoot?
Right. So this is not something that I've touched upon that much in this presentation here, but definitely something that I think is important because we do get this question quite a lot. And I think one is treating it like a context, having understanding the various aspects that can be extremely impactful. So being knowledgeable about all of these solutions and areas is hugely important. How can we support these? But I think the other one is really asking, we do need everybody on board because the more we can have this move forward, the better. Is asking how are we sort of supporting others to shift the mindset as well? How are we communicating how we're going to get to this place in the future? I'll give the example of why this is so important. Our work is quite well known in Europe, and in Switzerland, there was a referendum quite a few years ago, a popular vote, because they have direct vote in Switzerland, and they said, well, can Swiss live on one planet lifestyles by 2050 as sort of our national goal? Well, the vote lost, unfortunately, because they said, how could we do that? And there was opposition. There was lots of advertising from the opposition. And I'll tell you what the advertising looked like. There were billboards, there were websites, and they said, do you want to take cold showers, eat boring food, never leave for a vacation again in your life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. And that's really kind of this burden approach. If we're treating this like a context, how do we impart on others? Most of the people here listening are going to be the ones who are most passionate. But with our passion, how do we create that vision of a world of saying, well, this is the kind of world, this is the kind of city I want to live in, this is the kind of planet I would like to live in. How do we communicate that in a way that doesn't drive people away, but actually gets buy-in from the people around you? Because if we do treat it as our context, we need to ask, how do we succeed, and what is that vision of success?
Yeah, and so how would we do that? Or do you have any examples or recommendations for how we can communicate effectively to other people to help get them on board and to think more sustainably? And yeah.
Right. I think it really is asking people what that positive vision of the future is, what kind of lives they want to live, given what we're dealing with, given the reality of what the future is going to look like. But also, I think in many of these solutions and many of these possibilities, a lot of them actually, not only are they ways that are reducing our resource use, but they're ways that people would like to live. And I think that's quite important.
Absolutely. There's a question that was pre-submitted that I want to ask. It's maybe a little bit more technical, but it's asking if is overshoot calculated on what people need to survive, or does it consider the amount of food and other resources that Americans are consuming?
Right. So, I mean, this is the good news that I touched about it on a little bit, is it is actually looking at what we are consuming now. And given that the way we produce and consume is quite inefficient right now, it does mean that there's room for improvement. It isn't, as I mentioned earlier, sort of this theoretical, what is the bare minimum to survive? Because again, it's not, we're not trying to, if we are really pro-human, we're not trying to live a future where everyone's in misery, right? We want to live a future where we live good lives. And I don't think, anyone would disagree with that. That's something that, whether, it doesn't matter what your political beliefs are. We all want to have food and live under a roof and be happy.
There's a question that just came in kind of related to that, just asking how much climate stability and biodiversity can we retain into the future? I guess that's a highly kind of hypothetical question, and it depends on the decisions we make now, right?
Yes, those are very challenging questions because essentially there's quite a bit of a curve, and the more we act quickly now, the sort of timeline implications and the delayed effects of climate change on ecosystems means that we can keep emitting more and more and more right now, and it's just going to cause exponential damage in the future. But essentially, that also means the quicker we can get out of fossil fuels now, the better off we're going to be in the future. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you, except to say that action is important, early action.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just our energy transition, I think, is incredibly important too, as you touched on. There's another question here asking about the implications of like how we manage infectious diseases. So asking, would poorly managed infectious diseases or the dismantling of healthcare services like attacks on vaccines, for example, or biomedical research actually contribute to the date of Earth's overshoot?
Yeah, so I did see that question come in, and I think that's a complicated one. You know, I honestly wouldn't be able to say what that effect would be. But what I can say is that really it's you know, we are looking at two different axes, right? Again, we're looking at the environment and our life support systems and how, you know, the metabolism of our societies, but also we're looking at that as a means to achieve well-being. So in the end, I think to me that's very much a well-being question. Um, and obviously we all want to live better lives.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question, something to think on. Um, what about, there's a question asking about kind of your capacity as an organization to work with other organizations and partner to help bring about and help institutionalize many of the solutions that you're putting forth. So what are some options for increasing cooperation between institutions to research Earth's overshoot and those issues, and also to define counteracting policies? Like, are you working with different organizations, and what is that partnership kind of looking like? And what do you hope for the future in that space?
Right. So a lot of questions there, and I think important ones. I would say, let's see. I'm trying to go through the thoughts there. One of the most important things I'd say in answering that question is that there actually is quite a lot of research already in what's going on, what our current state is, you know, things from the IPCC and et cetera. And there is quite a lot of research out there already on the different types of solutions that are available today, which is also, again, another shout out to why we have made that Power of Possibility website. And one of the ideas is really that we shouldn't be waiting for agreements, whether it's a country or a corporation. How do we capitalize on understanding what the future is going to bring and prepare ourselves? So, you know, we do work with other organizations. We've worked with different ministries of environment on more specific ideas and regulations on how to sort of transition their societies to be low resource use, efficient societies with lower footprints. And a lot of that is really around the vision of how do they envision success for their country in the future. Really reframing that around, you know, a lot of our work with different ministries of environment have become books that the Ministry of Economy or the rest of the government treats as a burden. So really working with different groups, diverse groups, to look at the vision of the future, to say, what is it we really want to achieve? And how do we create that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great response. Again, there's so much to think about with these questions and just the concepts overall. So yeah, really thought-provoking. Thank you. There's another question here. I think you probably saw it. It's from the pre-submitted questions, just asking kind of about the future of our population and how it's going to be structured in the future, recognizing that many populations around the world are aging. So there's going to be a disproportionate ratio of working age cohorts relative to elderly cohorts, which are going to be dependent on social services and the government for support. So how is this going to affect like what you're doing in your work? And yeah, how are these population sort of structures going to be involved in the future of environmental sustainability, overshoot, and things like that? We've got like a larger proportion of the population moving into these older cohorts, and then a smaller proportion of the population representing the younger working age populations. So how does that look from an environmental perspective, and what possibilities are available there?
Right. So I have seen a little bit of the research on that, and I think it's quite interesting. Certainly, I think there are examples today. I think Japan is often talked about as a large example of that one. But I think there are in general two different sort of concepts I think about in terms of what that looks like moving forward. And I think the first one is, while that the research is quite interesting on that, and there's probably some reality in that, it is an economic analysis. So we're really looking at how much GDP production. If you look at some of the research, a lot of conventional economics says we need to maintain 3% GDP growth, or else our society is going to end. Well, I think that's a fundamental problem with economics. Part of it is, if we look at the context of our resource constraints, if we wanted to do a real comparison, we would have to compare that future to the future that incorporates the opposite future, where there are, you'd have to compare the future where there's a growing population and a decreasing population, but also incorporate the backdrop of resources and the global resource situation. And I think that paints a little bit of a different picture. Another thought that comes to mind as we talk about this is really something that was popularized maybe a couple elections ago with Andrew Yang. And, the whole premise was that, oh, well, technology is actually moving forward so quickly, we can be highly productive with less effort from humanity, which is why he came up with the concept of universal basic income, which actually was an interesting concept and got quite a few people thinking about what that future looks like. So in the end, I think those two ideas kind of jump out to me, and I think there is a much bigger context to how quickly the world is changing, and how and our resource situation that really we need to consider when we're thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question here asking about why or what caused Overshoot Day to be 8 days earlier this year in comparison to last year. They were saying that it feels like a really rapid acceleration.
Right. So we did write a little bit of a report on this, but I don't remember the specific details. In general, it's often always our CO2 emissions that are having the largest effect. One other effect that can be quite large is ocean uptake. So this is kind of a weird artifact of the accounting, is that there is sequestration of carbon by ecosystems, but also there's just a natural chemical-based sequestration by the ocean. A certain amount of CO2 emissions just goes into the ocean. And that fluctuates year by year as well. So those fluctuations can cause sort of the days to shift in different ways. We tend not to focus on one year-to-year change, because the data and the underlying science always gets refined, but rather looking at the trends. And the bad news is that it is trending earlier, but the good news is that over the last 10 years, that sort of trending earlier has decreased in magnitude, I would say.
Great, thank you. We've got about 2 minutes left here, so I want to just wrap up by asking you, what are you most excited about for the future?
Right. I mean, there's so many ways to kind of think about this, and I often actually just look at this. It is kind of an approach that has overlapping categories, but to me, it really is sort of this city one, you know, because the places where people live are so interesting to me, and the way we interact and how sort of culture and, you know, different societies shape our everyday lives. I really think it's quite interesting to think about designing the future in a way that just creates amazing sort of landscapes for us to live in. And I think that's where my creativity kind of goes off and thinks about, you know, not just cities, but as you kind of spread further out, how are even small infrastructures or more sort of sprawled areas, how could those be transformed into more efficient, livable communities?
Perfect. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a good place to end. We're right at the hour. So thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. I learned a lot. I think probably everybody else did too. And yeah, just really grateful to have you here and to get to learn from you and to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah.
All right, stay tuned, everyone. We'll follow up with an email with answers to questions we haven't gotten to today and other follow-up information from Stephanie. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day.